welcome everybody. Tonight's software supply chain and how to prevent, how they might be addressed. I'm Dominic, I'm the PR and comms member for IRMA. IRMA is one of the oldest BCS specialist groups, set up in 1965. We've been going a little while, and as John keeps telling me, set up originally as the auditing by computer specialist group. We have moved on a little bit. There's now over almost 2,000 members, and we do basically anything to do with risk management. So we've got people from security, insurance, risk, compliance, all kinds of different areas. So if you want to hear more, feel free to give me a talk. Come and ask me or John, our chairman. We're also doing this in conjunction with the information security specialist group, and Paul at the back here is the secretary of that group. So if you want to know more about that, he'll tell you a little bit towards the end. Tonight, though, we've got Anthony Harrison, director of APH10, which is a company on a mission to be the UK's leading source of expertise in software bill of materials through consulting, training, and assessments. Sorry. Anthony is born, educated in Manchester, where actually I first met him at a cyber bridge accelerator, which both his company and mine are both on. He's very proud of his heritage in Manchester, and he's actually come down especially to us tonight from there, and has to, I wrote this down, he has to get off again tonight. He's now staying overnight, so you can harass him at the end and ask lots of questions. So anyway, big BCS round of applause and welcome please for Anthony.
First question, Tony. It's not United.
Blue. Oh, that's probably controversial, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, then. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to give you this presentation. This is something I've been following for a number of years, and it just gets bigger and bigger. So I've got a lot of slides to share. Please interrupt if it's not clear. But yeah, there's a lot of information here. So hopefully some of it's technical, some of it's not technical. Hopefully it's about the right mix. Come on, let's get the technology to work. Why is that not working? There you are. Okay, yes. Proud Mancunian, the Manchester Bee. So that is the digital security hub in Manchester, set up to grow the digital cyber ecosystem in the Northwest. Lots of investment going on there, which is where I met Dominic, and there was a lot of startups. I was on a startup program just over less than 12 months ago on this journey. So I've been delivering computer systems and mission critical systems for 40 years. So my software's still running that I wrote very early on in my career. I'm not telling you where, but I'm also a great advocate of open source software, which is obviously something that's developed through my career. I'm great one. I want to share knowledge with the next generation. So I got involved in STEM being a STEM ambassador 10 years ago. They were my retirement plan, and I haven't started retiring yet. So basically, this is the next generation, and I mentor people in coding, engineering, and I support organisations like Coder Dojo, Raspberry Pi Foundation, Google Summer of Code. So yeah, so therefore, I'm quite actively involved in looking after the next generation. And we can talk a lot about that if you want afterwards. Let's look at what a supply chain is. So this is a definition. There's some quite important words there. It's a network. It's not one person. It's a group of people. It's companies and people. And it's producing something, ultimately, to a customer. It's delivery. So what does that look like traditionally? Grow something in a field, it gets collected, it gets transformed, it gets delivered, and you use it. I think we all understand it. We can understand the challenges. We've seen the challenges the last few years, and things like COVID and conflicts in the world, things like the Suez Canal getting blocked. We can see how that can get interrupted. What does software one look like? Well, we have a developer anywhere in the world. May be paid, may not be paid. They may be working with some of the software foundations. These are generally open source foundations, but there are other people that actually help develop software across a community. You then get people like Red Hat, Amazon, Microsoft, building that, acquiring software and packaging it for people to use. And then you get people who integrate software, maybe bespoke software, commercial software, open source software, to deliver a solution. And ultimately, you end up having a happy customer. Does that customer recognise the person at the end of there? Probably not. They will probably only see maybe one or two of those organisations. So it's quite a complicated thing to say you've got that flow of information. What happens if any of those chains were broken? Do you know where those chains are? Because the one thing that software is doing is getting more complex. People want agility, so therefore they need software to be built quickly. And by doing it quickly, you generally want to use other people's code and integrate it together. You become an integrator rather than a developer. And if you really think about it now, that's what software really is. You write a very little bit, and then you subsume it in a whole load of frameworks, libraries, other applications. Very different to when I started, where all the software we wrote was bespoke. So it's a huge transformation in 40 years. And that's quite interesting because I just picked this up last week. Nicholas Worth, who died just at the end of last year, was inventor of a language called Pascal. My first programming language. No, basically the language had everything you wanted to do to read and write files, etc. That was it. The language had everything. And it's an interesting statement. Has software become too bloated? Do you think now your applications, something like a browser, is 40 million lines of code? Nobody can understand that. Can you really think about 40 million lines of code, what it might look like? That's not one person writing that. This is a very, very efficient coder. So we've got a challenge. 90% of software has third-party components in it. Do you know where they are from? Well, unfortunately, people are finding issues with them, vulnerabilities. I think we're getting better at vulnerabilities detection, not that the software is getting worse. Well, that's growing at 15% a year. That's a lot of effort for people to triage that. And the consequences of vulnerability could be choose a figure. Any figure. Yeah. So we've got a challenge. Next one, come on. That didn't work. There you are. And we've got a challenge. The outside world is against us. And we're not in control of it. And if you're doing risk, you need to have all the data. Have you got all the data about all your software? I think it's very hard as a risk person to think, I haven't got all the data. I'm a data person. I can give you a categorical view that, yeah, that probability of that risk is low or high, unless I've got all the information. What happens if it goes wrong? Let's use a few examples. Equifax was probably not very few people that knew Equifax, but I think from 2016 everyone knew what Equifax was because they lost $2 billion because of a piece of software they didn't realise was being used. 140 million customers affected. That's just in the US. And they weren't very good at finding the problem. It took them 76 days to find the problem. Find the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem is a piece of out-of-date software, commonly used. And who remembers Log4Shell or Log4j? I think you've probably still got people still suffering from that nearly 2.5 years later. You can tell it's an important vulnerability, it's got a name. Yes. But when that happened, federal government told US agencies, we need to fix it before Christmas. Happened in 9th of December. It was impossible. I don't think people realised what it really meant. That's a landmark piece of computing. Insights. Or you could have another one. Come on. Where's that gone? What's happening there? Or you can have another one that happened this month, which is Docker containers. Very low level. Lots of systems now are built on containers in the cloud. Or you can have people hacking very, very simple applications. This was an example where I think a bit of JavaScript, it just changed the colour, print text in red or something like that. Someone just like modified it and added a denial of service attack just on the bind things. Still did the texting in red, but people didn't notice it also did something extra. People were downloading it 27 million times in a week without noticing it. And then there's various clever ways of actually mixing internal technology and cloud technology and getting some confusion and getting some interesting effects in your delivered applications. So we've got a problem. So when one of these happens, and you're a CISO or an engineering manager, and someone says, what's the impact? Are you delighted? Or you're more likely to say, not again. How on earth did that happen? Are we learning? US decided, no, we're not learning. So, April 2021, I know the world was very different in terms of we had all COVID and stuff like that, but the US government had enough. So they came up with a document which said we need to defend against software supply chains. This was coming on the back of SolarWinds, which attacked federal systems. That was a real eye-opener to say the power that software could have on government. A month later, that came out, the Exec Order on Cybersecurity. That is a landmark piece of legislation. Whenever you talk to the community I'm in, we just talk about the EO. That is important for anybody writing software anywhere in the world. The lessons in there are important. And what they recognised was the supply chain is critical. We need to, it's difficult to quite see that, basically improve the security of software by establishing baseline security controls. I think we understand what they are. Are we actually doing it properly? Requiring developers to maintain greater visibility of the software they are using. That's a really critical thing. Are you aware of what people are using? Have you just downloaded something? That's the challenge. Have you got those controls? And then make data available. Basically, in this case, it was for federal systems. On request, can you give me what software you're using? This was May 2021. They had 60 days to define how they were going to do that. And they also then they were going to give like the EPC or your energy thing you go when you buy your white goods, they were going to come up with a rating. I haven't seen that particularly. There are some examples we can talk maybe offline about some where that is. That I think will happen. It's going to be quite interesting for some bits of the software because that's going to be quite a challenge. So before we talk about the solution, I want to do a little bit of diversion because these all have roles to play. Programming languages, about open source software, because that's quite an important thing, a bit about dependencies, a bit about risk management. So first of all, let's look at programming languages. I went and there's an index, TB index, that tells you the top 20 programming languages, I think based on where the jobs at market is. So all the languages there in either bold are top 10. C++, SQL, Python, PHP. What do you notice about them? They've probably before security was even known. Top 20, COBOL and Fortran are still there, and they go back a little longer than that, longer than my career. Yes? And then there's some of the languages in italics. I know there are some critical systems in those languages. So we have a problem in the programming language, the software that we've got, the legacy software, and let's be honest, 90%, 99% of our software is legacy. is written in languages that security was not designed to be. And then you also look at the way languages are managing in terms of the ecosystem that they have. Do they have an active ecosystem? Go back to Pascal, there was nothing like an ecosystem. C and C++, nothing like an ecosystem. Things like Python, Rust, Go have an ecosystem. Those are things about how you control these third-party components. Quite a big step forward. How many of those languages are you using? It's an interesting question. Let's look at open source software. That's probably one of the biggest transformations in my career in terms of the role of open source software, which is now endemic. I think people will say open source has won. The last 25 years, there has been basically people are writing software, I won't say for free, they are writing software in a format that encourages collaboration and sharing. The UK is actually very pro open source. I see even more in Europe in terms of funding, but there's a lot of open source developers in the UK. Proportion to our size of country compared to India and US, we're up on the top there. And then there's two quotes here I got from open source conference early this month. 96% of your tech stack is open source. If you're relying, it's your infrastructure, if you're relying on it, that's your underpin, that's your foundations. And this is a quote from US government, OSS is everywhere, OS runs the world. Most governments couldn't survive without open source software. Most businesses can't survive. Most phones are running open source software. Look, just think of all the opportunities, look at all the innovation that's come because of the availability of open source. But then you've got a problem. Do you know who's looking after your software? This is a classic comic. Train came out in 2003, so 21 years. And the quote says, a project some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. You probably don't know him or her. It's probably a little utility they wrote that everybody requires on. Might be a regular expression cards or something like that. That so much is basic, but it's in there. You don't know him, you don't know them, you're not paying him, but your software is dependent on it because it's right at the bottom. I think he needs a bit of love, that person. Do we recognise that risk? That if they disappear, people do get fed up of maintaining software because they want to go and do something more exciting. What happens? It doesn't get ported to the next version of the operating system or your next new version of your language. It becomes, who looks after it? Let's look at risk management. Look at ISO 27001, the new one, 2022. Where's the supply chain? Supply chain is now, if you look at it, it's in a number of the annexes. Are those annexes being looked at? It's probably early day for the new standard, but certainly operational security. What's your approach to vulnerability management, patch management, update management? What's your approach to how you select your suppliers, your software developers? How do you do your thing? They're part of your supply chain. Even in the cloud, even outside does not mean out of mind. So please recognize where your software is, what's that full chain. Lots of controls there, there's 30 odd controls. Are those controls being recognized? And then this is a bit more technical. Software depends on other software. And we have what I'll call direct and indirect, transitive. The log4shell, the issue that people didn't realize was the depth of dependencies and how deep software goes. So although you're not including it in your application, some function that right at the deep berries of things actually did need it and you didn't know about it because it wasn't visible. And your choice of programming language will also depend because some languages love lots of dependencies. Let's say JavaScript has lots of them because their functions tend to be quite small. And then there's all the challenges. You can get conflicts, you can get multiple versions of the same thing. So you have maybe a vulnerable piece of software is still there, although it's been patched by a later bit of software, you can get all sorts of challenges. It's a real mess. And if you haven't got a language ecosystem, it's even harder. So the language ecosystem's trying to solve it. If you haven't got an ecosystem, I don't know how you can do it. Really hard. And typically you've got some syntax, some techie stuff. You can fix things. You can say it's greater than a particular version. You can say depending on the environment. So many other options. This one's got six different versions. Just these set things, depending on which version of Python I've got. And then you can say if it's on Windows, it's different to Linux. It's different. It's out of control. That's what you really got. This is one of the open source software projects that I'm involved in. Right down there is a dependency that if you go and look at it, it says not to be used outside organization. We didn't want it, it just happened to magically appear.
That looks like the NHS system.
It might be. I know, I think it probably would be a fit on the screen.
Anthony, can I ask a question about that? For operational security teams, how deep do you think is realistic or practical for them to go and to understand?
There's various schools of thought. I've heard people say only go to the direct.
Yeah.
And I totally disagree with that because most of the vulnerabilities are in the indirects.
Yeah.
So this is only 60 odd. I use Firefox as an example. Firefox is 141. So when you update Firefox, and Firefox updates every week or whatever, that just updating the top. Usually get quite to the top of the screen. There's another 140 components that they're not updating. They depend on, but they're not responsible for that update. So let's just think about what that means. Who's looking after that? Firefox are looking after their application, not their dependencies. And if you look at most of the vulnerabilities, 90% have come through transitive dependencies, the analysis that people have done. The building blocks. Right, so that's a bit of the background. So what's the solution? The solution, or a solution, is software bill of materials. So if people are familiar with a manufacturing thing, you're probably familiar with bill of materials when you're doing widgets and you get your little bits and pieces and you build it together and the bill of materials and comes out with a product. Software bill of materials is trying to do something similar for software. But it's quite challenging because we're starting in a bad place to some extent. So let's look at the best way I use it is I use an analogy, but I think we understand analogies. So when you go to a restaurant, what's the first thing you ever get? You got any allergies, any etc. Are you allergic to anything? And why is that? Because they don't want you to have an adverse reaction. What's the adverse reaction for software? I don't want some vulnerable piece of software because that could lead to an exploit. Okay. So what's gone into there is a set of ingredients. Do you know where they've come from? Do you know the pedigree of them? Yes, all the way down. So although you've got your flour, that's gone back to your farmer in his field. Yes, your mayonnaise has gone back to the chicken. Do you know all that things? Do you understand where has that been interfered with anywhere along that supply chain? Is it up to date? Because there are use by dates. Use by dates for software, support dates.
This is complicated because you've got a hierarchical database there and a relational database.
Correct. Yes. And you've got potentially, and ultimately, so my son doesn't like lettuce, so his burger will be different to mine. So I've got a product configuration issue as well. So are you keeping records of all this such that if there is an incident or an issue, you're able to quickly identify who's impacted? That's what we're trying to address. So the formal definition, and there's some quite important words here. First of all, it's technical, it's metadata that wants to be machine readable. You want to be able to pass this between tools, technologies. So you don't want to just write it down in a nice Word document. It needs to be in a structured format that people can use and analyze and extract key information. It needs to be shared, not squirreled away in a nice filing cabinet. It needs to be shared within your organisation and potentially with others. Maybe governments, certainly maybe users, maybe up or downstream your supply chain. This is risk. This is not software. This is all about risk, managing your risk. You've already managing your software, aren't we? Securely. I think we'll see later, maybe not. But actually, the solution to this is really looking at all the risks that your software could be exposing your organisation, your teams to. There's been a lot happening in the last 4 years about SBOMs. So you see, May 2021, the exec order, that was a real landmark, but that was response to SolarWinds, which happened 2020. It's quite interesting, you know, the world is very different because we're all in COVID, but there was a lot happening that's actually maybe people missed. Then Log4Share happened at the end of December. If people had got SBOMs, Log4Share would have been a relatively painless exercise. It wasn't, it was painful, which is why 2022 Linux Foundation gave a report to say, are we ready for the exec order for SBOMs? People were starting to become aware of it, but they were a long way off. So therefore, there was a huge amount of investment was being put forward by the likes of Google, Microsoft, VMware, Meta, Amazon, to try and basically help the community go together. So one of the things with SBOM Everywhere, so this is out of the OpenSSF, we'll see that later on, which was trying to improve the tooling, improve the education, improve the take-up of that. And that's ongoing. It's not an overnight solution because there's a lot of work. Europe then got in the act, so there's a Cyber Resilience Act drafted in 2022 after a lot of issues in terms of debate. That's likely to become legislation sometime later this year. That's going to have a huge impact on anybody selling any product that's got software in it in the EU in a few years' time. It's CE marking for software. For those of you familiar with the CE marking for hardware, this is CE marking for software. Big change. UK's done some consultation, DCIT, and there's responses came out last month. Big thing is the medical device market in the US in October requires this level of information for you to actually get a product on that market. So the FDA requires a transparency set. What components you've got in your software in your medical device. Medical devices have a lot of software in them. I think it's quite an eye-opener how much software they have got in them now. And we know what we know, you know, from UK's experience, the NHS, what happens when software can get attacked. WannaCry in 2017. There's a lot handy. SBOMs really started in 2011, when they were looking at license compliance. So this is what has moved on. And we'll see later on the number of use cases now that they offer. Big taking out, there's two formats, both international standards. One's an ISO standard, one's an ECMA standard. Come from different views. The SPDX one has come from the license community, it's the Linux Foundation. Cyclone DX has come from the OWASP, slightly more technical. They both cover the same grounds in terms of software bill of materials, but you'll see later on they're going further. And we have to recognise software does not live in isolation. But basically, that's what an SBOM is. There's some metadata. Who created it? When was it created? Who created? What type of tool created it? Who? Details about the component, and then some relationships. Quite simple, different formats, but ultimately it's a good set of data. this is really important. If you generate an SBOM as a developer, your business should be using them internally. So if you're a producer, you should be a consumer. Very important. It's not something you said, yeah, I've done that. Tick it, checklist. You should actually be reading what you're creating. Because it's used by anybody in your business, whether it's dev team, the ops team, PLC team, everybody, there's some of the information that is of value to them. And your end users can also make them value. Depending on your type of end user, they're going to have certain things they will want to extract from that they're going to find valuable. They will be different depending on who it is.
Are there any copyright problems here?
That is an interesting thing about. I think it's more like basically a data sharing issue in terms of is there any protective marking on it? At the moment, the data is just think of it like business data, the way you should share any business data. Don't think there's anything different. There's nothing copyright really, because most of the data is publicly available that you should be providing. But yeah, I think there's a few improvements. I think as people get used to it, there may become a few little nuances. I've certainly think when you see the TLP code, like is it unclassified type of stuff, that is in some of the aligned, some of the standards, but not in the SBOM standards yet. And I think that might be an improvement to say, I don't want this to be shared with my competitors. But it's just business data, so it shouldn't be anything different. There's a life cycle. If you do a software life cycle, as you develop your software adds attributes, adds detail. You want to keep get that. SBOMs do the same. So as you go through your life cycle, you have different types of SBOMs. A source SBOM just has all the list of all the source files. A built one may then start having what are the third-party libraries that I'm going to use, versions that I'm using. The runtime one says, and what have I actually built that I'm actually using? Because let's be honest, people build software that never gets used. Like test code. You might build 10 test code, but you don't want that in runtime. So you can start playing different analyses depending on where you are in the life cycle. So let's look at a life cycle of an SBOM. So the first thing you're going to do is create one. And I think one of the things the eye opener from the exec order was people thought that's all they had to do. But actually, as you've seen on the previous slide, there's so many different versions of an SBOM. So just one is not good enough. You need to be thinking about throughout your life cycle. So let's generate, and you can get things, and apologies, this is probably a bit techie, sort of things you might want to include is a name of a file, some checksums to give you some integrity. What type of it? Oh, it's a source file. It's Python in this case. What's the license? Who's written it? Copyright. Here's all valuable metadata that you could use as part of some of your gating processes. And then when you build it, you then maybe get a little bit more. Oh, where have I downloaded it from? Where has it come from? The right repository. Some other attributes in terms of the way you identify the component, the version of the component. All valuable information that localizes exactly what you've got. But one message, SBOM quality is an art, not a science at the moment. There are so many different tools out there having different levels of data. Obviously, that's my tool at the top. So to try and get the highest quality, because my view is I want to provide as much data that I've got as possible, because that gives you greatest uses. If you only constrain yourself to a minimum set of data, then actually that might limit its use.
Is there an ISO for this?
No. So there is, the US government came out with a minimum set of attributes, what they called attributes. And for speaking to them early this month, they recognised that was a good starting point, but now experience is now telling them that they need to go to have some more. But one of the problems that people are struggling with is the quality of the data that they're adding to the SBOMs is not there from the ecosystems. You'll see that in the later slide, some of the challenges that people have got. I don't think that stops people saying what they should have in them. You know, there are ways of correcting it. These work, yes. And I'm involved in one of the tools that actually validated some of the S-bombs. And some of the people were saying, I can't get my build to complete because some of the data is missing. Well, actually, that's a perfect example that you shouldn't be releasing software that you don't know the pedigree of. They didn't know where it come from. Well, that's a good example. I would stop their build. That's the type of thing you want to stop, because yeah, that could be a Trojan bit of software. So that's what you want to try and do.
Can I? So you giving all the technical stuff, but the technical stuff has been known for donkey's years about how to do it. But you're ignoring the most important aspect, which is the economics. The time and cost of doing all this is why people don't do it.
Can we look at that at the end, towards the end?
But why bother with all this technical stuff that we know how to do all this? This is just sort of off. It's the economic stuff that's important. If you solve the economic issues, the technical stuff will just follow.
So by the economic versions, do you mean the cost of maintaining software?
No, the cost of S-bombs and
So, okay.
keeping up to date.
Generating an S-bomb, if you've got a CI/CD pipeline, you should be generating an S-bomb now.
Well, yeah, if this, that, and the other, then it doesn't cost you very much.
Correct.
But what about if you don't have this, that, if that, and the other?
I think it's a valid point. I think
Well, it's a situation for most people today. It's not just a valid point. It's reality.
so. Okay, so if you go and look at what the NCAC says, we should be following secure development lifecycle, secure by design.
Well, bully for them, but I'm talking about what the current reality is. These things don't exist, and they cost time and they take money. That's the important issue that's stopping it all happening.
Valid point. But why don't we want to do it? Why do we not want to make our software better?
Well,
Because the cost of software being insecure and not resilient, the economic impact that will have on organisations.
yeah, but who pays that? It's if the end user pays it. Creating the S-bomb costs me money. If the cost of not doing it costs someone else money, then why do I care?
So I think it's a very valid point. If you look at the open source model, the open source model needs funding. And I think if people started realizing what the open source market cost, then end users will have to pay, then I think we'll make some headway. But if people get away without paying the full economic value of the software they are using, then we won't have security. We're already seeing the changes.
So what you're saying is none of this will happen until open source is paid for.
It's one of the mechanisms for helping. This is already happening. There's some slide later on which is going to show some of the things that are already happening in this and where that funding has come from. The funding is not coming from the UK, from what I'm seeing at the moment. The funding is generally coming from Europe and the US at the moment. But let's be honest, we are benefiting from that.
It also going to depend on your industry and whether your industry can actually compete with its regulators. If the regulator says you have to have this in place, you ain't got any choice. So the FCA will put things in place. If it's banking, you will need to do these things, and the cost of not doing it will be the cost of not doing it for the business. So it depends on your industry.
Yes, like medical is very heavily regulated, so which is why it's so easy for them to do it, because they're already essentially doing this.
But if you look at that, the FDA had been requesting this for 10 years. And suggesting it would be nice to do it, and nothing was happening, so therefore they then made the regulation. I totally agree with your comment about certain sectors, the regulated sectors, I think are going to have to do this. Other people will then benefit.
But as an interesting aside, I came from 30 years ago writing software for linear accelerators for Philips, and I came into banking and was horrified that every Monday morning we rolled back the bloody software. The linear accelerators I worked on never killed a single person. Some of our competitors did.
Yeah.
But they were up ahead of this. The FDA in the States can do this because if you're working in cancer treatment or if you're working in proper medical scanners, you don't kill people. That's your job. You know, do no harm is the Hippocratic oath.
There's a really important slide because the world of software has to change.
Grow up.
Yes, it has to go up. And I think the CRA in Europe has ruffled a few feathers with the thing, but actually what it wants to do is going to actually have a beneficial globally, not just in Europe. And if you write software, software is not written in a nation, it is written globally. Most of the developers are across the world. And we will have to do this. So let's get conscious, I've got a lot of ones to share, but it's a valid point about cost. What do you get once you've got an ESPON? What insights are you going to get? Well, you're going to find, have you got out-of-date software? And you're going to see in the slide of, if you like, how frequently software changes. You're going to see things like licenses. I would not allow people to use software if a license was not identifiable. I may have a policy decision say I'm not going to use a particular type of license because that's going to give me a risk in terms of if I use the license incorrectly, I can get sued and I have to give all my product. That's the consequence of not doing it. How much is changing between two versions, between two builds? Have I got all the licenses? Can I see the licenses? Are you doing a license check? I don't think we do that enough in the UK. Europe is very hot on this. There's lots of people where companies are being acquired and the license has jeopardized that acquisition because people were not looking at this. ESPON will give them that information at an instant. And not everyone can read JSON or XML, so therefore you need a way of printing it, publicizing to the different stakeholders. That's a way, there's various ways of doing that because there's a lot of information. And you're going to store it, and then you're going to do searches with it. Am I using Log4Shell? Am I using Log4j? That's what you want to be able to do. So when it happens, because it will happen, you can say, yes, no, we're not affected today. That's where we need to get to. Because the cost of Log4Shell was thousands of dollars, pounds, euros, across thousands of teams. If you the cost of Log4Shell across the industry, it's millions.
You've got there's no battery somewhere.
Oops.
Is this switched
Got
on?
its own switch.
All right. Thank you. That would have been embarrassing. And then this is what I found on another things. I had a clean installation and actually I found software wasn't the latest version. What was that? Because of one of the transitive dependency had what we call a pin dependency, a fixed dependency, which meant that software was not going to get updated. I didn't know that until I did the analysis. The cost of that would be catastrophic.
The trouble is, there's going to be so many false positives because this happens so often and there's such a large volume of it that people switch it off.
Let's wait. Let's hold that thought. I agree with you. Agree with it that we do have a challenge. Tooling has to improve.
But it's just volume. It's not about tooling. The tooling's here. The tooling will tell you, but it gives you such a volume of stuff that you go, oh, you switch it off.
So would you? So it's the same thing about. Well, do you not lock your front door at night?
But that's just one door. I've only got one door. I don't have 1,000 doors.
So okay. So are you? This is basically affecting thousands of customers, thousands of
It happens
individuals.
in all operational support contexts. If you have a log system for all of your alerts on a network, you will decide as a company policy whether you take the 5s, the 4s, the 3s, the 2s, and what level you'll work to. So in the same way, you could do the same thing. There has got to be a pragmatic approach to using this.
This is risk. This is all your risk. What's your risk appetite? If your risk appetite is I don't care, do nothing. Be quite happy. But actually, if you're in a regulated industry, you're going to have the regulator chasing you, and you're going to have to do that. You can't. You've got the same thing with safety. Safety is not optional. Security is not optional. We all know that. But you can have different levels of where you go. That's what I noticed when I did a change across 12 months of things. There's 3 peaks there. What's interesting is those 3 peaks are 3 holiday periods. Easter, start of summer holidays, and Thanksgiving Day. That's quite an interesting thing. When does software change? A lot of open source software is by volunteers. They do it in their spare time, the holiday time. Yes, that's a risk. Are you downloading software when there's a holiday time? When probably your staff are down, you're down staff, your numbers are down. To be aware, that was fascinating. That's an insight from the data.
Interested to map that globally as well and see where software was coming from in different
Correct.
places, holders.
Yep. And this is the amount of change. Some software is changing every week. Are you happy with that? Are you triaging that? Is that software, the quality of that software, exposing you anymore? Are you keeping track of this? This is just a simple application that I've done over 12 months that I'm involved in. I was fascinated how much data, how much change there is. And how much data people are not changing. Why are they not changing it? It's sadly because it's not maintained. You want to know when it's not maintained, because if it's not maintained, you may need to go to your architecture and change it to actually take that thing you don't want in your Nebraska problem. Are you monitoring that? Do you have a policy of how often your software needs to be maintained? How frequently are you going to look at your software? Has it been maintained? Are they looking at the number of issues? Are the issues going up? These are things you should be doing. And then you need to prioritize. And you may want to prioritize based on vulnerabilities, but there's so many different ways of prioritizing. Do you want to prioritize it on just a metric like it is a high or critical? I think that's not a good metric these days. Do you want to look at it on whether it's exploitable? That's probably more useful. That will get rid of your noise down significantly. Are the known exploits? There's something called the KEV, the US government maintains. There's 1,000 exploited vulnerabilities that you should basically, if you've got any of them, those are the ones you do. But there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise. And the quality of the data needs to improve, but people need to pay for that data. Organizations can make that data better. And then you fix it. And then you start again. That's your life cycle. Some organizations are doing that every hour. That's the agile life cycle. Some are doing it every month, every year. But you're doing that, and your SBOM is a baseline. We like baselines. Baseline is a moment in time. But don't forget that the outside world is changing, or even that baseline is fixed. And you're providing oversight, so everyone in the organization, the CISOs getting the oversight, the dev teams, the governance teams, etc., have value out of the SBOM that are giving them information that maybe they didn't know about. If they all know about it, happy days. But we wouldn't have a problem otherwise. That's your development life cycle. Software development life cycle. Everyone knows what a software development life is. Are we following the secure? Because these are all the things you should be doing. And SBOM can help you do that. I am dev teams. I wouldn't let anyone use an open source software unless it's gone through a license check, a policy check, and I could identify where it comes from. How many of dev teams just basically just let them freely download any software from any website? Are you controlling that? That's the control. And that's what you're going to find. You're going to find who your suppliers are that you're dependent on. You open source things. There are thousands of open source projects. Most of them are written and maintained by volunteers. But that might be your critical application, an algorithm that's really unique from maybe some researcher who's done that and has just taken it and put it on the open source GitHub or something that you rely on, your application. Maybe you need to give them some support. Because if there's a bug in that, do they feel obliged to do it? That's the risk. They're going to say, no, I'll do something more important. Europe is starting to recognise that. There's a thing called the Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany, which is now recognising they're giving organisations, open source communities, some money to maintain some of their open source software. If you're a large organisation, consider doing the same. It's a relatively small investment for huge payback, not to yourself. Think about the global impact. Ultimately, this is all about security and resilience. The cost of software being wrong is getting bigger. There are some challenges. People aren't very good at specifying the licenses consistently. There is an industry standard for licenses. People don't follow it. If you see somebody not following it, fix it.
Don't just be, it's more exciting writing your features than writing a little bit of metadata, but let's fix it. We're not very good at naming our components consistently. We're not very good at having version control numbers and people using the same version for different versions of the same software. Can you identify whether the software is really the same? Some people will change, and this is my problem with your a lot of false positives. People will take a library, remove functions they're not using, and still call it that version. The tools don't recognize that as a difference. Quality, the same quality. Who are you to use it? Everyone should be using it, but obviously share the data appropriately. SBOMs do not live in their isolation. Software doesn't live on its own. Software lives on hardware. You've got bill of material for your hardware. Most software now communicates with services. Have you got a list of all those endpoints? What data is being transferred? What happens if that service disappeared? What's the risk of that service disappearing? What's the business impact of that? Operationally, there's an OBOM, they call it OBOM. I come from the world of system of systems. That's the system of systems. Think of an F-35. This is what people are starting to think about, how I can have that chain all the way through, and all the way through design, all the way through to actually end products. And then you've got things like special things like cryptos. And we won't forget about AI. AI has another challenge. We'll see that in a minute. And there are different ways of actually supporting it, some different ways of storing it. Salsa is a way of looking at the sales chain and basically putting the checks and balances through your life cycle. Have you, from going from build to deploy, have there been any integrity changes? So there are lots of things now starting to merge. Vex is an interesting one, because what you have is you have a baseline. Every piece of software has vulnerabilities. Don't think you're ever going to deliver software with no vulnerabilities. I see procurement expecting things to be vulnerable free and delivery. Pointless. That's the problem we have with the tooling, because the tooling is very black and white. What you really need to be looking at is that vulnerability exploitable in my deployment? So if you've got a vulnerability that says, if I'm internet facing, then this happens, but if I'm behind a big firewall, it doesn't happen. Mark it doesn't happen. I don't need to fix it. That's the thing. So Vex is trying to define that. It's sometimes called vulnerability disclosure reports. That's what the US government have then put in for the medical devices, because they recognise that you will not have vulnerable free software because it doesn't exist. But you have to maintain that. And then, new vulnerabilities are coming all the day. 70, 80, 90 vulnerabilities a day, typically. So you need to, that's an economic cost. I agree that that's something that people are not doing. That's a new cost, but actually that's going to save your dev teams unnecessary work.
But if it's a missile guidance system, you won't want that in the public domain, will you?
No, yeah. So the sharing data needs to be as appropriate, yes? But actually, an SBOM is just a set of ingredients, it's not the recipe. Coca-Cola give you the ingredients, they don't give you the recipe. And anyway, you've already done an effect model, so you've already understand the effect. And anyway, if someone wants to attack the missile system, they've probably reverse engineered it and probably already got this information anyway. Right, X-bombs can be used for other things. Vulnerability assessment is the number one, which is what the US government started with first. But then license compliance is a big one. Europe is very much, the automotive industry in Germany is really all over this, because they've got to look at their software, are they using it? But I'm also seeing people using it for M&A, using it for escrow, regulatory things. This is going to be the big one. Starting to hear it in the healthcare industry, NHS are starting to see this in procurements. I'm sure the financial industry is going to start doing the same. This is thing. Isn't it wonderful? You can have one piece of one piece of information and you can use for all these different use cases in a standard. And you can share it globally. That's, I think, quite a big step forward. What about AI?
controversially, it's just software, isn't it?
It's coded human intelligence.
Yes, however, it has risks, but it has more risks. What about the data? Have you captured it? So we talked about the software transparency. We need the transparency of the AI because the AI is in your solution. So there is an ML bomb which provides captured information and works with software. So when people are using ML models, have you got the same level of transparency? You could have bias in your things. Are you aware of the bias? If they have this data, you can make that assessment. There's a lot has to be done. I'm well aware there's a very large contract in the US which is looking at over 600 models, looking at the bill of materials just for the AI. The data, go to some of the AI repositories, the data's a little bit immature. We need to get the quality of that data up. There is investment, huge amounts of investment. We're talking $50 to $100 million being funded by the large tech companies. Not the same because they're responsible, because they feel they've got to help. So people like Alpha and Omega, is Microsoft and Google working together to fund and run industry investments to allow people to make the supply chain better and investing. And in some cases, it's to fund people because these are the volunteers who have been doing this for years without any pay. I think that's the biggest thing that the US government realised when they started their analysis in 2021, how much people were not being recompensed and how important that they were dependent on. So you've got things like integrity, how to make sure the supply chains, the integrity of the supply chain. More tooling, more about the ecosystems. I encourage you, if you're interested in this, go and join them because they want people to be involved practitioners and they want those to be challenged. So there's one thing called SALSA, which is putting the checks all the way through your supply chain. You're doing that anyway, aren't you? Well, apparently not. That's why we've done it. That's why that's been defined. It's not being done consistently. IBM have given this. This has come out of IBM. Microsoft have looked at how you do a build and control it and how all the things and the auditing. So that's a very detailed process of how you do your release process. Don't think of that just as an operating system. Think about this as your mission critical systems, any of your applications. There are a lot of open source projects. Some are more critical than others. So there was a study that Harvard did a few years ago, the census program. They identified a couple of hundred programs or applications. You're thinking about things like your language ecosystems, things like Linux, things like Kubernetes that everybody relies on. Some of these are being supported by the Microsofts and the Googles of this world, IBMs, but some of them weren't. So let's look at what they are, who are responsible for that, and let's encourage them and maybe put some more rigor there to make them more secure. And ultimately, this is part of the funding. This is part of the economics that's required. But there's nothing stopping anybody funding an open source project. That's the simple thing, is to provide that. Right, I'm not a lawyer. But when I was at FOSDEM earlier this month, there was a very important thing about the product liability directive, where software is now going to come in scope. So all the liabilities, or they said the waivers you always have, use it as is type of stuff, that isn't going to survive. So as an organisation producing software, have you assessed the risk of your software?
Look, should be no different to safety. You do that for safety. Certainly, you know, mission critical start systems. So are you doing that for software? It's a very interesting test case. Mistakes. SolarWinds, the CISO is now subject to a trial, I think. One is fraud because of something they think they sold the stock market, but the more important one is internal control failures. Did they have the processes? Were they following the processes? All organisations have some processes. Are you following them? Have you thought about the consequences of those failures, those processes not being followed, and what that could mean to your customers? I think this is going to be really interesting. Might still be fine. No one wants to become a CISO, but actually, this is the real world. There is guidance. NCSC, they are changing it. Keep up to date. As with all things, it depends. But actually, they recognise supply chain is part of security. So let's just summarise. It's a lot more than just third-party risk management. It's a whole solution, part of the solution. The third one, security doesn't stop when the source code is released. That was someone sort of said to me, if I put away comment, I thought that's quite interesting. Yes. Don't think you've got past your obligation for source code is gone. You need to maintain your software. Software changes. The environment around that software changes even if your source code doesn't. Because of the things that it's dependent on. Think about all your suppliers. You already do that as risk. You do that, you know, you already do supplier assessments whenever you're doing business. Make sure you're looking at the software side as well, because they are there, and there are increasing number of organisations looking at the software risk in terms of, is that company likely to survive and be able to maintain their software for you? I want you to embrace software bill of materials. It's not mandated, but I think there's an awful lot of value in them that you can get. There's a cost, but I think there's a cost of not doing it that may be bigger, because we need to shift from a reactive to a proactive approach to security. And these are some of the things I think you want to think about SBOMs. It's all about trust.
So when are we going to get to the economic slide, please? Sorry to keep hassling you, but you're doing all this technical stuff, which is a minor issue, and you're ignoring the main issue, which is economic.
The cost of this is driven by the organisation, but it's also driven by the procurement process, which is where the solution procurement now needs to come in. So the cost of a system, when a customer buys that, you should be putting that as part of the cost to as part of your solution, because you should be doing that anyway. Now, the COA, we've got the discussions I've been involved with the COA, people recognise that the cost of software will increase.
So at the cost of who?
To the end user.
Right. But if I'm the software developer, that's not my interest.
But you're the producer. So therefore the cost of you producing your software is probably going to go up. Because you're going to have, because your responsibility, the COA requires you to maintain systems for 5 years. Maintain and update the software for 5 years. So as part of your cost of your software, that's where the economics comes in. You're going to increase your cost to your end customer. And the end users, because of the regulation, the end users need to recognise, because of the regulation, there is a consequence of that in terms of what they're going to.
Okay, so in that market, that is certainly true, yes.
Yes. And I think what I would expect is the regulated markets will move first, but actually a lot of software is used across the markets. So the regulated market, inverted commas, may subsidise the non-regulated markets because ultimately the same software is being used.
It's a continual part of software growing up. You need a TCO for everything you do.
Yes.
You need a business case. You need it to actually be professional.
Yes.
simply running around building software and components in a cowboy format isn't going to get us anywhere as an industry or as a professional body.
No,
This
that-
makes sense.
That's a good point. The regulated industry will be subsidising. Basically, That's a good point.
I think ultimately, to be very, this is pretending, I think the public sector will have to recognise that and work with the private sector closer to actually help that. Now, I'm seeing governments, I'm seeing Netherlands, I'm seeing Germany, I'm seeing France, governments working with the communities, the open source communities, to help them fund that. I would love the UK government to start doing the same. The US government is already doing that. And I think that will then help, because ultimately that will benefit everybody. Because the public sector is, most people are using the same bits of software.
requiring people to do the right thing or be good citizens is not very effective. One of the things I always say to reliability people is we're not throwing enough people in jail. Do you think people will be thrown in jail if the S-bombs are not accurate?
I think the SolarWinds test case, I think, will be interesting to see what comes out from that. I think the people need to be aware of the consequences.
Like going to jail?
Like going to jail, yes. So let's look at health and safety. If you put a system together that has a health and safety risk, your consequences as a senior C-suite, consequences you could go to jail. It's the same way like a fraud case in terms of that. And so I would hope that people now take security. Security is not optional. I hope we all agree. And I hope people then say, the board level, security is not optional. Security is a risk, and the consequences of that risk is financial, livelihoods, huge amounts of things. But we have to recognise that we have to pay.
The market will reject.
The market's going to be. I think there will be some companies are going to fail.
Cost of not doing it is going to be much higher than cost of doing it. And
Yes.
cost should not be a factor when you are developing something.
I used to have a thing when, going back to the 80s, quality costs, no quality costs more.
Yeah,
That's not true in reality, is it? Because look at GDPR, the ICO has been very light touch in taking action. And speaking from personal experience, but not wanting to write it actively, Capita were hacked and lost a lot of pension info.
Yeah.
And I was told, well, here's your year to
Yes.
or whatever, get on with it. Nothing's happened to Capitas, they carry on.
Yes. So I
Reputational damage.
yeah. I've got two or three more slides, and then I think we can do that, because ultimately there is, I think the ICO is the transition of the ICO into another organisation from the news told yesterday. So I hope that this is part of a growing things in terms of security in the biggest sense, not just
All
data.
of this is trying to make, like you say, the market
Yes.
grow up and
Yes.
do the things it should have been doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we understand some of those. Right. If you want to find more about S-bombs and what's happening in the US, there's a live webinar tomorrow, 5 o'clock UK time. Generally US, from looking at the agenda, it's looking at things like the medical device market and their experiences. That might be quite interesting to see what people are saying. US is basically very targeted at the federal market. But slightly different economics to here, but actually there's probably some good lessons. There's lots of education now starting to appear. These are two books from colleagues of mine. Cassie E. Shears, a VP of Schneider, worldwide supply chain. How do you manage your supply chain of products globally? So she's got really experience about what that is. That's taken a long time for her to write that book. Tom Elwich, I'm part of what's called the S-bomb Forum. This is basically an analysis of what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years about the S-bombs and what the challenges are, and offering some of the solutions. We as a community, need to work together. Community will make this work. Don't rely, don't just wait. We can make it better by shaping it. So that's where things like Vex is doing. So I'm helping the Vex analysis and trying to make it simpler. If you want to hear a bit more about me, there's 2 videos I've done. One is a techie one at FOSDEM. There's a whole day of things that exploit experiences of F-bombs, from what's happening in the specification things to some real world experience. And then there was various things at the State of OpenCon, panelists, some keynotes about S-bombs. Very interesting. Most of them are in the US. I hope people are now starting to recognise S-bombs are coming in the UK. And I did see a post this morning, NCSC actually mentioned S-bombs in one of their commenting on a US document about how to improve software resilience, which is by changing the languages that software is written. No more C and C++, please use Rust and Go. And that's where they've been saying that for 12 months. If you want to contact him, that's me. Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you, Jim.